Hello students, welcome to this last session on Cleanth Brooks' essay, The Language of Paradox. Students, first let's recapitulate what we have done in previous two sessions. We had discussed about Cleanth Brooks' role in the new criticism and also had a brief introduction with this essay, The Language of Paradox, which was published in 1947 in the collection of essays, The Well-Wrought Urn, Studies in the Structure of Poetry. And this particular text, this essay, is considered to be a seminal text in new critical school of literary criticism. Here, main argument of Brooks' theory of poetry that the best way to understand poetry is through the use of ambiguity and paradox. This very argument is discussed so far in this very essay. And just to understand poetry through the use of paradox, Brooks has emphasized on close reading and structural analysis of the text. And in the previous session, we had discussed that how Brooks has tried to prove that that poetry is the language of paradox because he has differentiated the language of poetry from the language of science. And he has also made it very clear that the referential language which is used in science is incapable of representing the specific message of a poet because the poet has to give expression to the complicated meanings, to the complicated experiences of human existence, and that is quite different from the approach of scientists, which is very objective one. So, while giving expression to the complicated experiences, a poet makes up his language as he moves on. And so his words are mutable, changeable. The meaning shifts when words are placed in relation to one another. And to be more clear, Brooks has also mentioned that in the language of a scientist, the denotations are the one and the only mean to get meaning from a particular text or a particular statement. But in the poet's language, the connotations, the deeper meanings, along with the surface meaning of a word, play an important role. And this very same argument that how paradox is the language appropriate and inevitable to poetry and how the same can be analyzed or interpreted in terms of a particular poem, Brooks has given a detailed analysis of paradox in Wordsworth's two sonnets and along with his theory of poetry as given in preface to lyrical ballads. Students, we all familiar with William Wordsworth as a romantic poet who's as a great nature poet, and his poetry is known for its preference for direct attack, insistence on simplicity, and distrust for anything sophistic. To be more simple, we can say that Wordsworth poetry is characterized with directness, simplicity, and unsophistication. But Brooks has observed that yet, although there is simplicity, there is a preference for direct attack, but still a typical Wordsworth poem is based upon a paradoxical situation. And how it happens, Brooks has explained or analyzed the same with an illustration from a famous sonnet by William Wordsworth, that is, "It is a beauteous evening, calm and free." The sonnet was written in 1802, and the sonnet described the poet's evening walk on the beach with his 9-year-old daughter Caroline. The poem begins in this way, that it's a beauteous evening, calm and free. The holy time is quiet as a nun, breathless with adorations. So the poem opens with the description of the calm and soothing picture of the beautiful evening, and that calmness, that tranquility is compared with the nun, but at the same time that calmness is presented in contrast to the breathless adoration. So look at the use of two adjectives. On one hand, the calmness of the beauteous evening is being presented, but the same is uh, explained through the simile of the nun breathless with adoration. So the use of these very adjectives, calm and breathless, they denote the apparent verbal tension. So that apparent verbal tension also just presents or just prepares a background for the paradoxical situation which Wordsworth uh, explains or clears in the very next stanza, or in the last stanza of this poem. He says, "Dear child, dear girl that walkst with me here, if thou appear untouched by the solemn thought, thy nature is not therefore less divine." Students, here the initial and surface conflicts is that the speaker, the poet, he is filled with worship. He is appreciating the beauteous evening. He is appreciating the calm and soothing atmosphere of evening, and he is comparing it with the holy nun. But at the same time, he is aware of this very thing, that his little companion, his daughter, little girl, she is not filled with that same sense of worship with which the poet himself feels. But towards the end of the poem, he just discovers that the girl is more full of worship than the speaker, precisely because she is consumed with the sympathy for nature, and not as in the speaker, in tune with nature while immersed in it. So in the last stanza, the poet opens the paradox that although the girl appear untouched by solemn thoughts, thy nature is not therefore less divine. Thou liest in Abraham's bosom all the year, and worshipst at the temple's inner shrine, God being with thee when we know it not. So here that girl, she worship more deeply than the self-conscious poet who walks beside her, because she is filled with an unconscious sympathy for all the nature, not merely the grandiose or the Solomon. Here, that unconscious, her unconscious sympathy is the unconscious worship, and she is in communion with nature all the year, and her devotion is continual, while the poet's devotion or concern for the nature is momentary. And so this is the paradox which not only underlies the poem, but something of the paradox informs the whole poem. Though, since this is Wordsworth, that who is just timidly making the paradoxical situation clear, or opening the paradox clear toward the end of the sonnet. And to be more elaborate, we can say that the comparison of the evening to the nun actually has more than one dimension, as it is done in the first stanza of the poem. The calm of the evening obviously means worship, even to the dull-witted or insensitive, and it corresponds to the trappings of the nun visible to everyone. So thus it suggests not merely holiness, but in the total poem, in the complete poem, this hint of holiness with which the girl's careless innocence, itself a symbol of her continual secret worship, stands in contrast. And this very same uh, paradoxical situation or paradox which just runs throughout the poem, the same is illustrated through one more sonnet by William Wordsworth, that is composed upon Westminster Bridge. This sonnet was written in 1802. This poem presents the description of the city of London and the river Thames viewed from the Westminster Bridge in the early hours of the morning. And here Brooks contends that the poem offers paradox not in its details, not in its detailed description of the city of London, but in the situation which the poet creates. Brooks has elaborated in that though London is a man-made marvel and in many respects in opposition to nature, then the speaker does not view London as a mechanical and artificial landscape, but as a landscape comprised entirely of nature. Since London was created by man and man is a part of nature, so London is thus too a part of nature. It is this reason that gives the poet, that gives the speaker, gives the persona of the poem the opportunity to remark upon the beauty of London as he would a natural phenomena. So this very same expression or the same intention on part of the poet or on part of the speaker is clear, very clearly explained or clearly presented in the last lines of the poem, that where that the poet is using the metaphor of sleeping houses, and the sleeping houses, this metaphor is very strangely renewed in these last lines, where he's saying, dear God, the very houses seem asleep and all that mighty heart is lying still. So here the point is that it is odd to the poet that the city should be able to wear beauty of the morning at all, but here he's saying that that something in contrast to the routine cycle is happening over there, which the poet is now presenting. And while talking about this very metaphor of the sleeping houses, Brooks has just elaborated that the city in the poet's insight of the morning has earned its right to be considered organic, not merely mechanical. That is why this stale metaphor of sleeping houses is strangely renewed. The most exciting thing that the poet can say about the houses is that they are asleep, and he has been in the habit of counting them dead as just mechanical and inanimate. So to say they are asleep is to say that they are alive, that they participate in the life of nature. So in the same way, the tired old metaphor which sees a great city as a pulsating heart of empire becomes revivified. So it is only when the poet sees the city under the semblance of death that he can see it as actually alive, quick with only life which he can accept, the organic life of nature. So in this poem, Wordsworth prefers, as is usual with him, the frontal attack. But the situation is paradoxical here, as in so many of poems, and the same, this very idea of giving expression to the underlying paradox in the very existence of human experience is expressed or directly stated in Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads. Brooks has quoted from the second edition of the preface to lyrical ballads, where in the preface Wordsworth has stated that his general purpose in his poetry was to choose incidents and situations from common life. But look at the point, students, that his intention was to choose incidents and situations from common life, and then how to treat them? So to treat them that ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. So to make some common really uncommon or prosaic really poetic, that was the main concern of the poet. And later on his companion, the great poet Coleridge, who collaborated with him in preface to lyrical ballad, he was also to state the purpose for him later, that in terms which make even more evident Wordsworth's exploitation of the paradoxical. Here I quote from the Coleridge, that I quote, Mr. Wordsworth was to propose to himself as his object to give the charm of novelty to things of everyday life. So students, look at this phrase, the charm of novelty to things of everyday life. And what this charm of novelty suggests? This charm of novelty is for the to excite a feeling analogous to the supernatural by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. So, in short, Brooks says, I quote, Wordsworth consciously attempting to show his audience that the common was really uncommon and the prosaic was really poetic. Unquote. So here, Coleridge's term, the charm of novelty to things of every day and awakening the mind's attention to loveliness and wonders of the world suggests the romantic preoccupation with wonder wonder, the surprise, and the same is also there in the neoclassical poets also. But here in these in the romantic poets, we say that although generally it is believed that paradox insist on the irony rather than the wonder, but Brooks has compared in his essay these poems by romantic poets with the poem by neoclassical poet Pope, but ultimately has proved that wonder and irony, both these things, both them just emerge together, and they merge or they fuse together in the lyrics of William Blake. Wonder and irony, they merge together to create a paradoxical situation in Coleridge's poems. And there is one famous poem, The Ancient Mariner, the same happens there. Then there is Thomas Gray's Elegy. So the variations in emphasis are numerous. But towards the end of this discussion about the analysis of paradox in Wordsworth sonnets, in Wordsworth's very theory of poetry, in Blake, Coleridge and Gray's poems, Brooks is to indicate that he is interested rather in looking at that how the paradoxes spring from the very nature of the poet. It is the language in which connotations play as great a part as denotations. And Brooks does not mean that connotations are important as supplying some more sort of frill or trimming, something external to the real matter in hand. I quote Brooks, I mean that poet does not use a notation at all, as the scientist may properly be said to do so. So the poet in this way, this is how, as we have seen in the Wordsworth poem, lines composed upon Westminster Bridge, or his poem The Beauteous Evening, that the poet within his limits has to make up his language as he goes on. As in we have seen in the very first sonnet, in the it is evening beauteous and calm, that how in the opening scene the poet is filled with this feeling that he is more in worship in comparison to his little companion, but towards the end he just opens the paradox that although that his sense of worship or his concern for the nature is momentary in comparison to that girl's constant continual communion with nature. So this is how the poet says that the paradox springs from the very language of the poet. This is how the poet has to make up his language as he goes on. So the point is that Brooks has proved his contention that referential language is not appropriate for the poetry just because of the complexity of the experiences it deals with. And so this very concept of expression of complexity of human experiences or human existence is the cornerstone to prove this very fact which Brooks has tried to prove in his essay that paradox is the language appropriate for poetry. So this is all in about uh, Brooks' analysis of paradox in Wordsworth's poem, and this is all about about how even the poet like Wordsworth, who is known for his simplicity, has just presented his poem through the language of paradox in terms of Brooks. Thank you.